Adjourn. The Honourable Member for Saskatoon West.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. On March 11th, in the wake of a horrifying incident where 2 homeless people from Saskatchewan were put on a bus to BC, I asked the government to commit to a national housing strategy that will end the homelessness in communities across Canada. I was encouraged to see that the first Liberal budget has committed some much-needed funds to supporting the housing needs of First Nations communities, victims of domestic violence, young Canadians, and to create more affordable housing. Unfortunately, after decades of neglect and indifference, Canada's social housing infrastructure is in tatters and is woefully inadequate. While the new money is certainly welcome and overdue, I think the government recognizes that much more needs to be done. Housing is one of the most important social determinants of health. Without a secure roof over our heads, it is difficult, if not impossible, to work, study, raise children, or be healthy. And it costs all of us so much more in healthcare costs, lost potential, and human tragedy. Too many Canadians are in precarious housing or have no housing at all, Mr. Speaker. Many, many more are paying too much for housing. This is a situation that must change. The Canadian Housing and Renewal Association estimates that roughly 140,000 families are waiting between 5 and 12 years for subsidized housing in Canada. According to a recent study, 40% of renters spend more than 30% of their household income on the cost of rent and utilities, the level at which many say housing costs become unaffordable. About 20% spend more than half their income, which housing advocates say puts them at high risk of becoming homeless. My honourable colleague, the member for Hochelaga, has recently completed a report on homelessness in Canada after a 3-year tour of more than 30 communities, and she found that the situation is devastating. I'd like to quote my colleague, Mr. Speaker. She said, "Throughout Canada, I met tenants who had to choose between paying rent and buying groceries. In a country as wealthy as ours, this situation is unacceptable. Housing is a right for all of us, and eliminating poverty starts with ensuring that everyone has a roof over their head." Mr. Speaker, the current housing crisis, it's not new. It has been getting worse because of government inaction. A former Liberal government brought sweeping reforms to the National Housing Act in 1973, and the minister responsible for housing described adequate, affordable shelter as an elemental human need. Mr. Speaker, how times have changed. The dark decades since have seen the abdication of leadership on the federal level, both by the Liberal and Conservative governments, accompanied by diminishing investments, devolving the responsibility to lower levels of government. We don't even have a Minister of Housing in the Cabinet. This Liberal government has a chance to turn the crisis around. The funds announced in the budget are a good first step, but there's so much more to do. The member for Hochelaga's report, A Roof a Right, sets out a sensible approach to correcting the housing deficit in Canada, and I ask the government to act on the recommendations in her report. The member for Hochelaga has also introduced 2 bills aimed at addressing the housing crisis in Canada, one that would include the right to housing in the Canadian Bill of Rights, and the second that calls for the implementation of a national strategy for secure, adequate, accessible, affordable housing. The UN Committee on Economic, Social and Cultural Rights has also expressed concern about the persistence of a housing crisis in Canada and has called on the government to bring in a national housing strategy that recognizes the right to housing. Mr. Speaker, investing in housing isn't an expense, it is an investment in individuals, communities, society and the economy as a whole. Will the government commit to immediately implementing a national housing strategy? Thank you.